Restoring men in history. And what's in the news today? Culture battle. The government battle between the big government people who don't even want people to know where the money's going, and the limited government people, which was ratified, of course, by the states, the limited government. Federalist 51, James Madison called the father of the Constitution, is what we're going to talk about today. And a lot of times people say, Chuck, what makes America great? And two of the things I say are in this paper, which are federalism and the separation of powers, which both protect your freedom and choices. Federalism enables you to have limited federal government and then work it out in the states for those big issues like gun rights, abortion, and others, and gives you freedom to choose which state you live in. Federalism, separation of powers. Separation of powers protects you from tyranny like a king or a dictator in theory. And the separation of the powers protects one branch of government, there are only three, not four, from gaining too much power in theory. So we are in a battle of ideas. Are we going to limited government, which was ratified, or big government? Where are these issues supposed to be decided? Well, they're really, most of them, domestic, are supposed to be decided at the state level, not the federal level. And that's why you get into this. The most important election of your lifetime's coming up. And it is because they've moved too much power to the federal government and moved away from federalism. But how do you govern a large sphere? The only way to govern a large sphere is with federalism, so that you can have people that disagree on some things but still have common interests, values, and virtues, but we have disagreements and then they're worked out in the states and you can move with your feet. Make sense? I'm going to give you some real excerpts, and if you can stay with the language, I think it's important to know this Federalist 51. This is Madison's promise to the states. If New York ratifies, you'll get this. This is what we're giving you, Federalist 51. If New York ratifies, he was trying to get New York to ratify because it was so populated and so important. You needed New York and you needed Virginia. Those two states you really needed to ratify. So here's James Madison of Virginia writing to New York. To the people of the state of New York, to what expedient then shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments and lay down the Constitution? There it is, separation of powers. Very concerned. They had faced a strong parliament and a king, and they didn't want anyone overreaching again, especially the anti-federalist. Going on, the only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior provisions are found to be inadequate, the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may by their mutual relations be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. What's that mean? This is a key cornerstone of American principles. And he's talking about separation of power, and he's very concerned with freedom and people staying in their constitutional spheres, not getting out of them. Not overreaching like the Supreme Court has done, not overreaching like Congress has done, or starting unconstitutional agencies. And the president has also overreached during historical times. All three branches have overreached and infringed upon the states. Let's go on. In order to lay a due foundation for that separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of government, which to a certain extent is admitted on all hands to be essential to the preservation of what? Liberty. So he believes this is incredibly essential to your liberty, to your freedom. It is evident that each department should have a will of its own, and that's important, right? Because you need them to be fighting for their constitutional sphere so that it protects your freedom by keeping the powers separate. We don't want someone infringing on their power either. And consequently should be constituted so that the members of each should have as little agency as possible in the appointment of the members of the others. So for the most part, following the Constitution, the president's going to be able to pick and get his picks, and the House and the Senate leaders, the House and the Senate are going to be able to choose their leaders, right? So going on. And here's one that bureaucrats and elected officials seem to ignore. Were this principle rigorously adhered to, it would require that all the appointments for the supreme, executive, legislative, and judiciary magistrates should be drawn from the same fountain of authority. What is that? Who is that? The people. You, the people, through the channels having no communication whatever with one another. Where do they get their authority? From you, the people. And they seem above it all many times, right? At those hearings, when you look at those hearings, they seem above it. I don't know if we're going to put a clip up from a hearing where they seem above it all, but the agency heads and others, in fact, the bureaucrats seem some of the worst, as well as some of the senators and congressmen, seem above you, the House of Representatives, some of them. And that's where Doge comes in, right? Because if the authority is from you, you need to see where all the money is going, don't you? We need to see where the money's going. And we need an audit of the IRS and the Fed. And so mainly the executive branch gets to make their picks according to the appointment clause in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. So you follow that, and there are principal and inferior offices, right? Some don't need that. Then he goes on to talk about each branch being independent and then to the security of it. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. So you got to fight and protect your constitutional sphere. And what do? They laid it out pretty well. The legislative branch writes the law, the executive enforces the law, and the Supreme Court determines if some law is unconstitutional. But all the branches should call out if something is unconstitutional, right? And all should be defending and upholding the Constitution. And some examples, they set up the power of the purse for the House. That gave them some power. They set up a veto for the president. So there are ways to protect yourself. Congress is supposed to be the only one writing laws, not the Supreme Court and not the executive agencies. And here comes one of my all-time favorite lines in the Federalist Papers. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. So each person has to be ambitious enough to protect that sphere and his powers there. Or what do we get? We don't continue to have separated powers if they don't protect. So if the Supreme Court goes beyond their powers, the legislative branch needs to call them out. The executive branch needs to call them out. And the Supreme Court has gone way beyond their enumerated powers. If Congress goes beyond their powers, the Supreme Court and writes a law that's unconstitutional, the Supreme Court can call that law unconstitutional. But all of the branches can say something is unconstitutional. So, has the legislative branch and the executive branch protected themselves from the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court has gone too far? What about some cases? Griswold, Connecticut. Have the states protected themselves? Roe v. Wade. Obamacare. So when certain branches go beyond the powers that are enumerated, who has stood up? So we don't want the federal government encroaching on the states and the people from either branch, from either the legislative branch or the judicial branch or the executive branch. We don't want an executive agency writing laws and enforcing them. That's the separation of powers. In fact, we don't want unconstitutional agencies that were reserved to the states, those powers. In other words, if they didn't have the enumerated powers to do it, it's an unconstitutional agency, right? Number two, if some agency is enforcing and writing laws, that would defeat the purpose of the separation of power. So Congress needs to take that back and not allow agencies to write laws. The Supreme Court can't write laws, only Congress can. And you've seen that transgressed by the executive agencies and by the Supreme Court. And these next lines are some of my favorite all-time line in all of the Federalist Papers. They're so beautifully written. Listen to this. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So men are not angels. So we must have control on the men and women in government because of human nature. See, these founders were so brilliant, they understood human nature, and that's what's amazing about them. They understood that you would need protections, or we would end up in tyranny. That for freedom to last, men were not angels. And that is an argument for limited government, right? Because if men are not angels, we don't want too powerful of a federal government. If men are not angels, it is the argument for limited government and holding each branch to its specific and few defined powers. And remember in 45, numerous and indefinite powers for the states, that's Federalist 45, numerous and indefinite powers for the states, few and specific powers for the federal government, Federalist 45. And most of the state power would handle all the domestic issues. How far away are we from that? That's, again, why every election is the most important election in your lifetime. And it has become that because the federal government is way too big and powerful and operating unconstitutionally in areas they do not have enumerated powers. And here's where accountability comes in. If the power comes from the authority of the people in the states, what has to happen? You have to know where the money's going. And DOJ is important to that right now. There must be accountability for politicians and government bureaucrats. Back to Federalist 51. A dependence on the people, he goes further. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. Now, what does he say there? The people are not supposed to be dependent on the government, but the government dependent upon the people. How far away are we from that? And I think that's one of the reasons politicians love entitlements. Get certain people on the government entitlement programs, and then you think you're going to get their vote, and they get many of those votes, right? So what does that do? Moves us to tyranny, right? Because they're supposed to be dependent upon the people, not the people dependent upon government. Then he goes on to checks and balances, very important. The constant aim is to divide and arrange the several offices in such a manner as that each may be a check on the other, that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights. Again, worried about what? The individual and one branch interfering or gaining too much power from another. An example of that is dividing the legislature into two, the House and the Senate, right? They divided that power because why? In theory, the legislative branch was going to be the most powerful and the Supreme Court the weakest. How far are we from that? Look where the Supreme Court has been just not very good in many cases. Taking power from the states, using the 14th Amendment in the wrong way, applying extra meanings to the 14th Amendment that were not there, right to privacy, substantive due process, to integrating the 10th Amendment in Roe v. Wade and Griswold, Connecticut, Obamacare. Different modes of election, right? House is elected differently than the Senate and the President. Going on, there are moreover two considerations. This one's important. It's on federalism. Particularly applicable to the federal system of America, which place that system in a very interesting point of view. First, in a single republic, all the power surrendered by the people is surrendered to the administration of a single government. And the usurpations are guarded against by a division of the government into distinct and separate departments. In the compound republic of America, and this is the important part, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments. Okay. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. So end here, federalism, that's federalism. Again, Federalist 45, most of the powers were supposed to stay with the states and all domestic powers. So federalism is the key to what? Not only your freedom, but choices, right? But it allows you, if most of the domestic laws are decided at the state level, what does that give you? That gives you power. And it doesn't make it the most important election of your lifetime because most things are begun to be done in your state domestically. Health, police powers, all of those reside in the states, right? So you get to, let's look at some examples, gun rights. If you love guns, you can live in Texas or Tennessee. If you don't like guns very much or you don't like gun rights, you can live in California or New York. So it allows you to move with your feet. Mass tried that health care. Let the states be a laboratory for experiments, right? So you can decide which state you want to run. What does that help with? If you want to govern a large sphere and you have people with some different interests, but still that we have a lot of common interest and we still have a lot of similar values and virtues, at least with federalism, we can get along without this enormous division fighting about abortion constantly, fighting about gun rights constantly. Because if it's done in the states, you can move with your feet. And each state can decide, and that's the way it was supposed to be, by the way. That's the only way to govern a large sphere. So it's very important. And that's why I think $15.6 billion was spent on the 2024 election. Why? Because of this. Because we have not been following federalism, which takes away your choices and the ability to run a business. Let's say different states, and it takes away the competition of the states as well. Right? Because if Tennessee has few regulations and Texas has few regulations and they have less taxes, you're probably going to want to do a business there versus California. Some people call it California. But anyway, Here's the point. You can choose. And if you want all those laws and regulations, you can do your business in California. If you want high taxes and high regulations, you can do it in California. But it gives you a choice. It gives you freedom so that every election is not the most important election of your lifetime. And so that we can still have some disagreements and not have this major division going on. And the reason it's so heated today is too much is done from the Supreme Court, which should be done by state courts. Because Congress didn't stand and they gave out too much power to the federal government. And they got in areas where they had no enumerated power, and it needs to be rolled back and restrained. The federal government must be restrained so that we can all get along better, so that we have less division, so that we have more choices. And this is really important. We don't want every election to be the most important. Supreme Court picks. Why are they so important? Because all this power has been moved to the federal government. But what was ratified was a limited government, which gave you choices and freedom. And all those big issues, think about it, if they weren't at the federal government, which they weren't supposed to be. Obergefell had no business at the federal level. That should have been done at the local or state level. Or not at all. Remember, you don't have to pass a law. But anyway, that's the point. And lastly, think about how important your state elections, and you would be more closely involved if all of those powers still resided in the states and the people at the state level. It would make those elections more important. And you might get more involved in community. It'd be a good thing. You might care more about your state representatives. You might be more in the community and involved. When it gets up to the big bag federal government, and then they're making all these decisions, I think it removes you to a degree from your friendships and from your community. But I think if you have to be involved and things are decided in your local community, let's say it goes back to the states and the states allow it to go back to the local community, you can be really involved in that level and it could be important. And who's it supposed to be derived from? The people anyway, so why don't we make it close to the people? But remember, if we want freedom to continue and last in America and be the land of the free, it's up to us, the people.